"Excuse me, this is the faculty lounge, not for substitutes." Her voice was sharp, crisp, laced with superiority as her manicured hands swept across the small round table. Without hesitation, she flicked the folder he had just placed down. It hit the floor with a humiliating slap, papers fanning out like broken wings. One sheet, the corner of an ancient parchment photocopy, landed at her feet, and she stepped on it with a click of her stiletto without even looking down. The man who owned the folder didn't say a word. He crouched quietly, collecting each paper with slow, deliberate care. Around them, no one spoke. No one helped. A few professors glanced up briefly over their coffee cups, then returned to their quiet chatter, ignoring the scene like it was routine, like it was normal. His name tag still pinned crookedly to his brown tweed blazer read, Dr. L. Harlan, substitute. But no one cared. To them, he was just that, a substitute, disposable, unseen. As he reached for the last paper, a voice floated down from above, drenched in sarcasm. "Maybe next time, try the janitor's closet." The room chuckled, not loudly but enough to sting. He stood up slowly, adjusting his glasses, calm as ever, saying nothing, just one brief glance toward the window, where the autumn light cut across the wooden floor like a golden line, dividing the room between those who judged and the one who endured. She had no idea the man she just humiliated held the only knowledge to solve a mystery that baffled scholars for 100 years. He didn't belong here, at least, not in the way they saw him. The staff mailbox labeled substitute faculty still held a crumpled packet of welcome forms, untouched since his first day. His office, a forgotten utility closet on the basement level, smelled faintly of chalk dust and damp carpet. No nameplate on the door, just a faded sticker. Storage B12. Yet inside, the walls were lined with books. Not the generic textbooks piled in faculty lounges, but worn, annotated volumes. Ancient cartographic records, linguistic pattern studies, cross-cultural mythologies. He had brought them all from home. His home, back in Harlan, where shelves curve around every wall, where he and his mother used to spend entire nights tracing lines on maps that never made it into school curriculums. His mother, Helena Harlan, had been a librarian her whole life. Quiet, brilliant, underestimated just like him. She used to say, "Langston, people will call you what they see, but that's never the same as who you are." That voice echoed in his mind now as he hung his old tweed coat on the bin hook behind the door. The same coat he'd worn through his doctoral defense. The same coat he'd had folded over his arm when his mother took her last breath, holding his hand, whispering one final request: give her knowledge back to those who never got it. That's why he was here. Not for tenure, not for accolades. Just one semester, she had asked, and he had promised. A return to Wexley University, the very place where he had once sat in the front row, hungry for every detail, every theory, every lost idea from the ancient world. The same halls where he had once been lauded as the youngest recipient of the Granfield Award for Theoretical Mapping. Now, 2 decades later, he walked those same halls unnoticed, dismissed. Even the students barely glanced at him when he entered their classrooms. "Is this the sub again?" they whispered, bored, scrolling through their phones. Some didn't even look up, but it wasn't the cold shoulders that stung. It was the silence. The way his presence didn't register at all, like he was a ghost haunting an institution that no longer remembered what he had once meant to it. And yet, he came every day, on time, prepared, a dark blue thermos of black coffee in one hand, a stack of annotated readings in the other. He taught with care, never phoning it in, even when the chairs were half empty, even when his lectures were met with yawns, because he believed, fiercely, that one curious mind in the room was worth speaking to. Maybe it was the quiet girl in the back, taking notes in a secondhand notebook, or the boy who lingered after class, eyes flicking toward the maps he had drawn on the whiteboard. Someone, he knew, was always listening, and in the stillness of that belief, he found purpose. He refused to substitute truth for status. That was a silent creed, one he carried stitched into every step across the cracked campus bricks. On Fridays, when most professors packed up early, he stayed, alone in the sub-basement archives, dust coating his sleeves, running his fingers across ancient university records, documents misfiled, overlooked, lost to time. It was there in one forgotten drawer behind a broken rolling cabinet that he found it, a scroll fragment, aged but intact, labeled only in a dialect almost no one remembered. Almost no one. But he did, and his breath caught, not out of excitement, but recognition. This was the language his mother had shown him when he was just 13, reading by lamplight over a shoulder, a remnant of a civilization long erased from the curriculum, but never from his memory. He held it gently, reverently, like a message reaching across centuries, straight into his hands. The lines etched on its worn surface weren't just decorative, they were coordinates. Or at least, that's what his gut told him. The kind of gut feeling you don't ignore when you've spent your life decoding forgotten truths. He slipped it carefully into the folder he always carried and walked away with nothing but the quiet certainty that he had just stumbled into something important. He didn't know it yet, but that moment in the quiet underbelly of Wexley University was about to awaken a mystery that had gone unsolved for 100 years, and he was the only one left alive who could read the first clue. He sat in the back row of the faculty meeting, not because he wanted to, but because the chair labeled visitor was the only one left untouched. No one motioned for him to come closer. No one asked for his thoughts. It spoke over him, around him, like he wasn't even there. In that echoing conference room with marble floors and a long oak table polished to reflect the ceiling lights, Dr. Langston Harlan felt more invisible than ever. Around him were professors with embroidered blazers, personalized mugs, and voices sharpened by decades of tenure. And when he spoke, softly, offering a minor correction on a misquoted historical reference, someone laughed. Not kindly, not engagingly. It was a short, sharp laugh, followed by dismissive, "That's cute. The substitute knows Latin." The room chuckled, again not loudly, but enough to sink in. His hands rested quietly on the folder in front of him, the same folder that still held the fragment from the archives. But he said nothing more. He had learned, painfully, that speaking without permission in rooms like these was like dropping stones into a still pond. It rippled, but only in ways that returned to drown you later. The dean, a stout man with silver hair and a voice built for televised lectures, closed the meeting with an announcement that sent the room buzzing. The university was reopening a century-old case study, one tied to the mysterious disappearance of a key artifact connected to Wexley's founding benefactor. The artifact, an engraved compass belonging to explorer Julian Troughton, had vanished sometime in 1913. Rumors, speculation, and failed academic theses had swirled for generations. But now, thanks to an anonymous donor who'd offered a significant research grant, the university had the means to investigate again, hoping for a breakthrough that could put Wexley's name back in academic journals worldwide. A project committee would be formed. A lead would be chosen. Dr. Harlan leaned forward slightly, not out of ambition, but instinct. He had read every known publication on the Troughton expeditions. He had diagrams, notes, even a childhood memory of hearing about that very compass during a Smithsonian summer program his mother had snuck him into when he was just 10. But before he could even lift his hand, Professor Melrose stood up. "I'll head the committee," he said. No debate, no vote, just silence, then nods. The others agreed without question, and just like that, the decision was made without him. The dean turned, almost as an afterthought, his gaze briefly landing on Harlan, as if remembering someone had been sitting there all along. "Of course," he added with a genial smile, "we'll be inviting student assistants to observe. Perhaps you'd like to nominate someone from the substitute track to participate in a supporting capacity." There was no malice in his tone, just a gentle pat on the head, disguised as inclusion. Substitute track. The words hung in the air like a second slap, as if he hadn't carried 2 decades of field experience, as if he hadn't translated dialects these very men mispronounced in lectures, as if the degrees on his wall, one of them earned under the same scholar who had once advised the university's current president, had somehow expired. Harlan felt a quiet burn settle in his chest. Not rage, but something colder, Something ancient. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The decision was made. The room already breaking into side conversations. Plans about sabbaticals, guest lectures, book titles. He gathered his folder, pressed the corner of the parchment flat against the inside pocket, and rose. No one noticed. No one said goodbye. He walked out the same way he had walked in, unseen. Outside the lecture hall, the late afternoon sun cast long amber slants across the stone courtyard. Students bustled past, clutching coffee and deadlines, earbuds in, unaware that history had just repeated itself inside that room. Another gate closed, another mind dismissed. Harlan paused at the edge of the quad, letting the breeze lift the edges of his coat. A janitor sweeping leaves near the bench looked up and nodded. "Hey, Professor," the man said with a casual smile. Not sarcastic, not mocking, just real. Harlan nodded back, holding that word in his chest for a moment longer than necessary. Professor, not substitute, not temporary, not invisible. He took the long way home, his footsteps echoing through the quieter wings of campus until he reached the small, dim apartment the university had given him. There, between two worn shelves, he opened a leather-bound field notebook. Tucked inside was a hand-sketched diagram, one passed down from his former mentor, long forgotten by Wexley's archives. It was a sketch of Julian Troughton's compass, markings along its edges, symbols not listed in any publication, symbols no one on that committee would recognize. But he would. He already had. That night, Harlan spread the old scroll fragment across his kitchen table beneath the amber glow of a desk lamp he'd brought from his Harlem apartment. The markings danced beneath his fingertips like a language, almost ready to speak. He retrieved his field journal, cross-referencing the symbols with old field notes, triangulations, even the obscure syntax of Eastern expedition maps he had studied a decade ago. A pattern began to form. Not a message exactly, but coordinates disguised as ornamental loops. The kind of thing only someone trained in lost cartography systems might recognize. His hands moved steadily, driven not by adrenaline, but by a calm certainty. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply following the lines no one else could see. By midnight, he had identified 3 key locations that matched early Wexley land surveys, areas long buried under modern buildings or misclassified in the archive's digital catalog. He penciled them onto a blank map and stared. Something was missing, not from a map, but from a story. The artifact hadn't just been lost. It had been deliberately hidden. That part he felt in his bones. And someone long ago had left this scroll not to be found by chance, but by someone like him. Someone patient, someone invisible. The next morning, Harlan skipped his assigned lecture and headed straight for the sub-basement archives. The lights flickered overhead as he descended the narrow stairwell, the air turning cooler, heavier with the scent of mildew and ink. He signed in at the dusty logbook. His was the only name for the past 3 days, and made his way toward the restricted collections room. The door groaned open. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. He moved methodically, scanning shelf labels, pausing at a battered wooden drawer labeled Troughton Foundation, Miscellaneous. Inside, stacks of yellowing documents lay tangled in brittle string and forgotten folders. He gently lifted a bundle and unfolded a set of letters, many unread, several in old dialects. Then, between 2 faded envelopes, he saw it. A small leather-bound notebook with Troughton's initials etched faintly on the cover. Inside were sketches, rough outlines of terrain, strange symbols, some matching those on the scroll he'd found. But more shocking was the final page, a hand-drawn diagram showing a burial site, not in a remote location, but directly beneath Wexley's oldest lecture hall, buried under decades of indifference. He blinked. This wasn't just academic anymore. It was intentional concealment. 2 days later, Harlan waited until the project committee's interim meeting opened its doors to observers. He entered quietly, standing near the back as professors shuffled in, arms full of notes, self-importance in tow. When there was a lull in the discussion, he stepped forward. "I believe I may have located one of the artifact's final documented positions," he said, calm but direct. The room fell into a moment of silence, not from awe, but confusion. Then Professor Melrose leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And you would be?" Harlan didn't flinch. "Langston Harlan. I taught in this building before most of us had access to digital archives. I've been reviewing old topography diagrams. There are gaps your models don't account for." Laughter flickered at the corners of the room. Melrose offered a dry smile. "Well, it's good to see the substitute faculty engaged, but we're focused on peer-reviewed leads at this time." Someone chuckled. Another whispered. Harlan nodded once, without expression, and turned to leave. But as he did, he caught the eyes of a young research assistant seated in the corner, a student with a clipboard who had been quiet the entire time. Her eyes didn't mock. They followed him as he walked out, thoughtful, unsettled, curious. That weekend, Harlan returned, not to the archives, but to the basement of the university's maintenance wing. He had remembered something from Troughton's sketches, a reference to iron frames and steam, terminology outdated by modern standards, but commonly used to describe the original furnace chambers of Wexley's East Wing, long since decommissioned. He found a rusted door half covered by cleaning supplies and an old janitorial coat rack. No key, but the latch had long given up the fight against time. Inside, cobwebs thickened the corners, and pipes groaned like forgotten voices. But at the far end of the chamber, behind an old boiler, he saw a stone panel built into the wall, unmarked to most, but unmistakable to him. The carvings were faint, but they matched the diagram in Troughton's notebook. More importantly, tucked into a seam between the stone and the frame, wrapped in wax cloth, was a second scroll, this one entirely intact. As he held it, breath caught his throat. This wasn't coincidence. It was a trail, a test. He looked up at the dark chamber ceiling. They wouldn't believe him yet, but it didn't matter. The countdown had begun, and this time, he wouldn't let history be buried twice. Harlan knew he couldn't approach the committee again. Not yet. Not without proof that couldn't be laughed off the table. So he worked alone. By day, he taught disinterested students in echoing classrooms, nodding politely when staff ignored his greetings. By night, he cross-referenced campus construction blueprints, handwritten journal entries from Troughton's crew, and city zoning documents dated back to 1907. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. The location of the compass wasn't lost. It had been erased. Redacted footnotes, misfiled coordinates, whole paragraphs omitted from digital archives. Not by accident. Someone had deliberately buried the trail decades ago, and no one had noticed. Or worse, no one had cared. Harlan built a reconstruction model using acetate overlays and physical maps, layering historical data by hand on his kitchen wall, like a war room. The pattern was undeniable. The compass had been entombed in a space no longer listed on any active blueprint, a sealed access tunnel beneath Founders Hall, now used to store janitorial equipment. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just a discovery, it was vindication. But he knew what came next would be harder than piecing together history. He would have to confront the very institution that had trained him, stay silent. On Monday morning, Harlan submitted an anonymous brief to the university's internal research forum, a platform mostly reserved for doctoral proposals and departmental notices. But within the brief, he embedded a coded reference, a triangulation model referencing the Founders Hall substructure, and a challenge. If the coordinates are wrong, I will publicly recant. If they are right, I expect nothing more than the truth to speak for itself. By afternoon, the form bust. No name, no credentials, just a diagram so precise it couldn't be amateur. Melrose dismissed it as a hoax, but two younger professors began running simulations. And that evening, a quiet knock came at Harlan's office door. It was the research assistant, the same one whose eyes had followed him out days ago. Her name was Elise. She had printed the brief, annotated it. "You mapped an erased corridor," she said. No one else noticed because no one looked at the thermal decay line from the original furnace routing. Her voice was steady. "I believe you." Harlan blinked, not because of her words, but because someone had finally said them out loud. Not "you're brilliant," not "you're wrong," just "I believe you." And that for the first time cracked something open, far more than a hidden tunnel ever could. That night, under cover of fading dusk, Harlan and Elise descended into the maintenance access beneath Founders Hall. She had discreetly borrowed the universal key from facilities. No questions asked. The hallway smelled of dust, iron, and the weight of decades. With only a flashlight between them, they reached the sealed hatch at the far end, the one marked for boiler access. Though no heat had run through those pipes in 50 years, Elise pried the rusted lock. It gave with a groan. Inside, the space opened into a narrow, domed chamber lined with limestone bricks. It was colder here, quieter. At the center stood a stone plinth, unremarkable except for a single brass fixture embedded in its center. Harlan stepped forward. The fixture wasn't a fixture, it was the top curve of a compass. Still intact, still humming faintly with magnetism. He reached out. The brass was warm, and as he touched it, something strange happened. The floor around the plinth shifted slightly, a low hiss escaping the cracks. Beneath their feet, ancient gears moved for the first time in a century. Elise gasped. Harlan didn't, because he understood in that moment. The compass wasn't just a relic, it was a key, and someone had designed this place to stay locked until the right person came along. The next morning, without ceremony, Harlan walked into the committee strategy session. Elise walked beside him, carrying a reinforced archival case sealed with chain of custody tape. Conversation ceased. Melrose frowned. "You can't just barge in. I believe this belongs to the university," Harlan said, placing the case on the table. No raised voice, no challenge, just the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed permission. Elise unclasped the locks and opened the case. Inside, the compass rested on padded velvet, gleaming beneath the overhead lights. Alongside it lay photographs, diagrams, and a full report. Thermal decay data, architectural overlays, linguistic comparisons from the original expedition notes, signed and cross-referenced. For a long moment, no one spoke. Melrose leaned in, reading the report. His jaw tensed. Another professor removed his glasses, blinking hard, and one by one, the silent room began to shift. Not because they were glad, but because they realized they had missed it. Missed him. Harlan didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply turned to leave. As he reached the doorway, the dean's voice stopped him. "Softer now. Dr. Harlan, would you consider leading the next phase of this investigation?" Harlan paused. "Only if it's not considered a substitute for someone else." Word spread fast, not because the university issued a statement. It didn't, at least not right away, but because students began to talk. First in the halls, then in online forums, then in lecture chat threads. "Did you hear about the substitute who found the compass?" He wasn't a substitute. He's Dr. Langston Harlan. His name began to surface in conversations where it had once been forgotten, whispered between admiration and disbelief. A week later, someone chalked his name on the quad sidewalk in sprawling letters. "Truth isn't tenure." It stayed there until the rain came, and when he returned to class, something had shifted. Students sat straighter. Phones stayed in pockets longer. A few even asked questions. Not many, not dramatic, but enough. Enough to feel like someone was listening. Elise had quietly shared the case data with the library's digital archive team, and before the month ended, Wexley's official website featured a new exhibit, the rediscovery of a Troton compass. Research led by Dr. L. Harlan. Just that. No photo, no spotlight, but for the first time, his name stood beside the word lead. And that, to him, meant more than a plaque or a paycheck. It meant someone had finally corrected the record. In a faculty lounge, the air was different. Not tense, not reverent, but quieter. Conversations paused a second longer when Harlan entered. No one said anything overtly. There were no public apologies. But cups didn't rattle when he reached for coffee pot. Chairs didn't shift away when he walked past. One afternoon, Professor Melrose glanced up from a newspaper and said, simply, "Your cross-referencing was impressive." It wasn't an olive branch, but it wasn't nothing. Harlan nodded once and moved on. He didn't need validation from the very halls that had once erased him. But the silence had changed flavor. It wasn't dismissal anymore. It was awareness. And that, in academia, is more powerful than applause. A few of the younger faculty members started inviting him to peer reviews. One asked him to co-author a journal article. He declined gently. "I've spent enough time asking to be seen. Now, I think I'd rather listen to those still waiting." And with that, he began mentoring Elise and two other students who, like him, had once been passed over without reason, not because he wanted to build a legacy, but because he knew what it meant to carry knowledge alone, and he refused to let the next mind go unseen like he had. By early spring, a regional historical journal picked up the story, not because of the artifact, but because of the anomaly in the footnotes. An uncredited brief submitted by non-listed faculty member led to one of the most significant rediscoveries in Wexley's recent history. The phrasing was cautious, careful, but the implications were clear. Who gets to speak? Who gets remembered? A podcast episode followed, then a quiet feature in a Sunday magazine, and slowly, messages began to arrive from adjunct professors, from retired researchers, from young students still invisible in their own programs. They wrote to Elise first, then to Harlan directly. "Your work made me stay one more semester. I thought I was the only one who kept doing the work, even when no one cared. Thank you for showing me it's not about being loud. It's about being right and patient." Harlan never responded publicly, but he read every message, some twice. And when he passed that old chalkboard on the ground floor of the humanities building, he smiled. Someone had written in careful white strokes. The compass didn't lead to gold. It led to him. No one erased it. It stayed up for weeks, not because it was profound, but because it was finally accurate. On the last day of the semester, Harlan walked the perimeter of the campus just as he had during his first week back. Same coat, same quiet steps, but a different weight in the air. Not heavier, just clearer. He stopped by the library steps where a small gathering of students were chalking quotes from forgotten figures onto the concrete. Elise waved him over. One of the students offered him a piece of chalk. He smiled but shook his head. Instead, he pointed to a blank square and said, "You write something." The student paused. Then, after a moment, wrote 4 words. "Wisdom doesn't need permission." No one spoke, but they all stepped back to let the words dry. Harlan stood there a moment longer, then turned and made his way across the quad, past the benches, past the names etched into marble, past the buildings that once ignored him. He didn't stop because he didn't need to. He had never needed to. His purpose was never applause. It was clarity. And sometimes, the ones who go unheard the longest are the ones carrying the clearest message, not because they speak loudest, but because they never stopped listening. And in that silence, they built something no one else could. Truth that stands, whether anyone claps for it or not.